So our speaker tonight is Mr. Tom Glass. Tom is the founder and leader of Texas Constitutional Enforcement, which focuses on how Texas elected officials can stop the feds from violating the U.S. Constitution in Texas and stop other Texas election officials from violating the Texas Constitution. Tom has spent his life
another fundamental concept of constitutional enforcement.
Since retirement from his career in information technology from ExxonMobil, he has spent full-time at the last 4 Texas legislative sessions, pushing liberty issues that he thinks important. In addition to his largest group, Texas Constitutional Enforcement, Tom runs several other groups on social media, including Texas Legislative Priorities, focused on seeing that the legislative priorities and other platform planks of the Republican Party are enacted, and protect the Texas grid, focused on hardening the electrical grid against attack. Tom is a graduate of Odessa Permian High School and earned a chemical engineering degree from Texas A&M University, an MBA from Harvard Business School, and a JD from the University of Houston Law Center. I give you Tom Glass.
Thanks for letting me be here. I am circulating a sign-up sheet for my group, Texas Constitutional Enforcement. When I showed up at the Texas Legislature 4 sessions ago, after I had retired, I wandered around saying, I've got some good ideas. Y'all want to hear what I have to say? And they would always say, who are you with? So I figured, okay, I'm beginning to get a feel for how this game is played. You're supposed to, for you to be paid attention to in Austin, you have to say you have a bunch of people behind you. You have to have a group to get respect. So I said, okay, I can play this game. And I just set up a Facebook group called Texas Constitutional Enforcement. And the other one I created was Protect the Texas Grid. Those are the 2 I did 4 times ago. And since that time, Texas Constitutional Enforcement has grown to 6,500 members, and Protect the Texas Grid is right around 2,000. So when I go to Austin now, I can say I have people behind me, or at least they said somewhat agree with what I'm saying. So that's how I did it. As we've gone, especially in this last year where social media and big tech and Facebook in particular has gotten very oppressive, and taking our group down once before they put it back up, we decided we better expand into some alternatives. So we're also on MeWe, Texas service called Freedom Lake, Bladbook, Gab, Telegram, and LinkedIn. And I'm circulating the sign-up sheet for you if you want to be on our email list. So that's a little bit about our group. Let's see if this thing works here. Oh. I want to make sure. Is it working? Oh. Try one more time. Great. All right. And we put it in full screen. Now, let's try. Good. All right. I want to talk about the situation we're in. Get this set a little bit better. It's pretty dire. The way I see it is domestic enemies of the Constitution have stolen complete control of our federal government. I say stolen deliberately. And this crowd, which Mark Levin now calls American Marxist, and I agree with that, wants to take everything we as Texans hold dear. You name something we hold dear, they want to stop it. The way I figure it, the way to preserve the liberty of Texans and the Constitution, we've got to figure out a solution that involves not working in Washington, D.C. And that's what Texas Constitutional Enforcement is all about. To make matters worse, while we were in the middle of this fight, our own state government decided to follow along with the guys who want to take our liberty in D.C. and started violating the Texas Constitution with this COVID tyranny that we've got. So we've had a two-front war. I hate two-front wars. But anyway, that's the situation we're in. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about, in general, how we can pit the power of one level of government that's closest, usually closest to us, against another level of government, usually sometimes called a higher level of government. Because I don't think any of us want all by our lonesome to go up against the awesome might either of the feds or of the state of Texas. I think having our elected officials on our side is a pretty good way of trying to band together. You know, the Marxists have been have taken over our federal government and are trying to take over the government here in Texas, have been organizing. You know, they have this thing called community organization. Obama was community organizer. ACORN stood, a lot of people didn't know, was an association of community organizers for reform now. But they've been organizing for decades, if not a century. If we're going to win our liberty back, we've got to organize too. And I'm going to be talking about some ways to do that this evening. Okay, let's see. What do we got next? Okay. Oh, no. Wrong direction. All right, we'll get this straight. All right, the first thing I want to talk about is the Constitution. I've heard people criticize the Constitution because we've lost our liberty. That just sounds ridiculous to me. But Thomas Sowell, who's a fantastic conservative, said the Constitution can't protect us unless we protect the Constitution. The piece of paper, the Constitution, or even a good idea, is not self-enforcing. John Wayne said, when you allow unlawful acts to go unpunished, you're moving toward a government of men rather than a government of law. Because the guys that don't enforce the law usually probably do it selectively. They do it for their buddies. And of course, when you're talking about enforcing a law, normal law, that's important. But enforcing the supreme law of the land, our Constitution, seems to me to be even more important than enforcing regular laws. And I'll say one other thing about enforcement, and that is everybody knows that enforcement entails risk. That's why we respect our law enforcement officers. Because you never know. It's kind of like the bad guys who are not doing what they're supposed to. They may want to fight back. There may be some risk involved in trying to stop the bad guys from doing it. Well, constitutional enforcement involves risk too. But, you know, you have to consider the risk of not enforcing the law to everybody. And the risk of enforcement is a much better risk to take than a risk of not enforcing. It's the fundamental concept of my group. Let's see. All right, so let's talk about constitutional enforcement. And I'll talk about several of the general ideas. The way I figure it is, constitutional enforcement is all about the people who have sworn the oath. Scott talked about who has sworn the oath. The people who have sworn their oaths to defend the Constitution, honoring it. It's about exercising independent judgment about constitutional meaning. When you swear an oath to the Constitution, you are not swearing to whatever 5 out of 4 guys on the Supreme Court of the United States say. You're swearing to the Constitution and your independent judgment about it. I can talk more about that later if I get asked, but that's a fundamental concept, a part of constitutional enforcement, is independent judgment. And then, I've already talked about, the Supreme Court is not our supreme ruler. They are not the final arbiter of constitutional meaning. If you read the Constitution, I'll challenge you to find anywhere that says that they are. In fact, the 10th Amendment is pretty clear. It says if we haven't delegated a power to the federal government, then it's reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. And I will challenge you to find anywhere that says the federal government, in any form, can decide the limits of its own power. They can't. The Constitution doesn't do that. We the people are the final arbiters. We're the boss around here. We make the final decision. That's another fundamental concept of constitutional enforcement. And the cool thing about constitutional enforcement, since it's done locally or at the state level, it means we don't have to rely on a New Yorker or a Californian or a whole bunch of other states to win our liberty back. we can just start doing it right now as soon as we have the will. Okay, so I would say the essential element or the spirit of constitutional enforcement is resistance or defiance. One time somebody asked me the question, said, Tom, are you talking about civil disobedience? And I had to think about that. Are you being a rebel? It's like, no, I don't think so. The whole idea of this is the resistance and the defiance is to unjust acts of our federal and illegal acts of our elected officials. Another way of saying it is, when you talk about disobedience, there's a master-servant relationship embedded in that term. When you say I'm disobeying the government, it implies that I'm disobeying my master, right? Who's the boss around here? It's we the people, right?
Right.
And the thing is, when an elected official violates the supreme law, the Constitution, they are our servant. They're the ones being disobedient to the supreme law. They're the ones being disobedient to us. That's the mindset we've got. That's what makes constitutional enforcement so legitimate. The thing is, we have the legitimacy. They don't. And it's important to remember that when you're going into the battles of enforcement. We're the boss. You're a disobedient servant. Stop violating the law. Stop violating the rights of the people that are your boss. That's what constitutional enforcement is all about. Now, I would say there's two elements of constitutional enforcement. One is a formal declaration that an act of a governmental official is engaged in is unconstitutional. It would be great if you actually write it down. You don't have to, but if you write it down, that's great. Even better, if you write it down with the reasons why. Kind of like a judicial opinion talks about why they're reasoning about what's going on. So formally declaring an act of the federal government or an act of a governmental official to be unconstitutional is a very important thing. It gets stuff right. And then there's the enforcement piece. It's the enforcement is stopping them. We have a wonderful statute in Texas. It's called the Official Oppression Act. And it says if you are a public servant and you knowingly violate the rights of a Texan, it is a Class A misdemeanor. That's a wonderful statute. Now, and they usually apply it to law enforcement who've gone rogue, right? But I have a secret for you. I can do the President Biden thing. I can whisper. Federal agents are public servants too. I know that federal agents think that they are our masters, but they are subject to the Texas Official Oppression Act just as much as our local law enforcement or other local officials are, and we need to start using it. One of the things that's very interesting to me is about who is it that actually prosecutes the Texas Official Oppression Act. Since it's a misdemeanor, what's interesting is every county has different segmentations of what the prosecuting attorney or attorneys does. But in Hood County, it's my understanding, and we have both our district attorney and our county attorney here, so correct me if I'm wrong, guys. But as I understand it, the county attorney in Hood County is the guy who prosecutes the misdemeanors, which would be the Official Oppression Act. And the district attorney does things other than misdemeanors in higher level. So I just thought that's interesting. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit more as we go. Okay, there's one other thing I guess I would say about this, which is an interesting formulation. At this moment in my life, I call myself a thinking man of action. I hope that this speech, I talk about the balance of taking action, but also giving good reasons for doing so. When I was a young man, I was all about action. And I got married, and I walked one day into the room where my wife was just sitting. And she was just sitting there. And for me, this was a foreign concept, just sitting there doing nothing. It's foreign. And I said, what are you doing? And she said, I'm thinking. No, was the most foreign concept that I'd ever heard of. Sitting around thinking? What is it? And so I criticized her for that. And I said, thought without action is useless. And she said, action without thought is destructive. So maybe we ought to think about it and say while we're doing what we're doing, then we got to take action. You got to have both. Okay. All right. I want to talk about the power of constitutional enforcement. Going up against a large government, the federal government or even your state government, individually is a losing game. I mentioned that already. The thing is, constitutional enforcement pits the power of Texas or the power of your locality versus the higher level of government. Constitutional enforcement, if it's going up against the feds, says, feds, if you mess with one Texan, you mess with Texas. Didn't your mama tell you not to mess with Texas? It's a powerful thing. It's a powerful tool for liberty that we ought to use. Okay. Now, we don't need legislation to do any of this stuff. Honoring the oath, any elected official who honors their oath, and it doesn't have to be elected, it could be law enforcement or military too, who may or may not be elected, can do it. Sheriffs can do it, constables do it, cities, counties, state executives, state judiciary. And the people that are doing the enforcement can do it in two ways, passive or active. James Madison wrote Federalist 46. He said, when the federal government starts doing unconstitutional things, you've got four ways that states can stop them. He was reassuring people that this Constitution was not going to allow the federal government to get out of control. And the most important of the four reasons was, he says, state officials can refuse to assist the officers of the union. That's a passive way. The thing is, if you think about the number of people that the feds have at their disposal, it's very small compared to the general populace. And if the general population is saying, we are going to resist, we're not going to do what you're saying because it's unconstitutional. If our local law enforcement officials and our state officials just sit on their hands and don't assist them, we will win by and large, right? That's passive. And then we have the active, which sometimes is called interposition. It's using that Texas Penal Code, including the Official Oppression Act, to actually arrest agents of the government, especially federal agents of the government, who are knowingly violating the rights of Texans. That's interposition. That's teeth. That's enforcement. But passive can do it too. The resistance is an important thing. By the way, a very fantastic thing happened in the Texas legislature this last session. Several bills passed, but the most important one, in my opinion, was one that instructed state and local law enforcement to refuse to assist federal agents if they try to enforce any federal firearms laws that are regulations that are enacted from here forward. And I thought that was a wonderful victory for the Okay. And then I want to talk about counties. And I'm especially excited to be here in Hood County tonight because I think Hood County has the potential for being a shining, it already is, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But it can be a shining example of how constitutional enforcement can be used to protect the citizenry from oppressive government at the state and federal levels. When I talk about the political ecosystem, I'm talking primarily about the LEOs, the sheriff and the constables, the prosecuting attorneys, the county judge and the commissioner's court, and then the judiciary. If you have that group of people on the same page, acting in a constitutional way, exercising independent judgment about constitutional meaning, you can stay free here in Hood County, even if the rest of the state and the rest of the nation goes to pieces. It's a powerful thing. And the cool thing about it is you have more influence over your county officials than you have over the guys in Austin, and certainly over who you have over in D.C. You engage your local officials to do what they were elected to do and what they were tasked to do by the Constitution, which is to protect your liberty. That's the power of this tool. By the way, one of the people I learned a lot from was Sheriff Richard Mack and his Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. If you're not familiar with Sheriff Mack or his organization, I encourage you to do that. Some of the other people that our organization pays attention to a lot are Chris Ann Hall. I don't know if you've heard of her. Yeah, she's wonderful. Tom Woods, who wrote a book called Nullification. And then there's a number of others. But at the 10th Amendment Center does fantastic work along those lines as well. And essentially, when I tried the Texas constitutional enforcement, I tried it to be, since constitutional enforcement is done primarily at a state level, it can be done at a county level, I figured you need an action organization in a particular state to implement the good ideas that these people have been talking about that I've just mentioned. And so I'm trying to be the bridge between the idea people and where the rubber meets the road in constitutional enforcement. That's kind of the mission of the group. All right, let's see what we've got next. Okay. Now, you can do legislation, and there's a good reason to do legislation. I focused a lot on that. Why do you need legislation? Well, unity, in getting together and being organized and being on the same page, I guess. Billy Graham said, courage is contagious. You know, if you have one person in your political ecosystem, like your county sheriff or one person in there, if they're going up against the rest of the players in the ecosystem, not a cool thing. It takes lots of courage to do that. You can have lots of impact, but it's not an easy thing to do. If you can get everybody on the same page through legislation or through talking to each other, you're in a lot better shape. There's one other problem we've got in Texas, and that is that there's this guy named George Soros. I don't know if you've heard of him. He has spent millions of dollars in pouring into the primary races of Democratic district attorneys in the major counties of Texas. And he's captured my home county of Harris County, where I live now, Travis County, Dallas County, and Bexar County. Okay? And he's tried other places. When the people, which I've never seen it proven, but I suspect highly that Antifa and all the BLM rioting that was going on this last summer were paid for by George Soros. It's my bet. I would love to have some law enforcement guys that just figure that out for us. Wouldn't it be nice? But anyway, when those riots happened, at least in my home, Harris County, they arrested 800 people that night. The Soros-backed district attorney let every one of them go. Okay? Do you think that those people are going to use the constitutional enforcement approach to fighting the federal government? So, if we're going to get constitutional enforcement at this stage in Texas history with the current lay of the land, we've got to bring the Attorney General into the fray. You know, the Attorney General is given prosecutorial authority on independent prosecutorial authority on only a few things. The only one I know for sure is election integrity related stuff. And even that, there's some hoops he has to jump through to do it. But everything else in terms of prosecution, the local district attorneys and the prosecuting attorneys around the state can't, if they invite the Attorney General and his resources in to help them, then he can do so. One of the things in the legislation I filed in two different bills over the years, is to try to give the Attorney General independent prosecutorial authority over the Official Oppression Act. I would also like to see it over the Sedition Act and riot and other things that are where people are undermining our government, and corruption is running rampant in the localities. I think that'd be wonderful, and it would help. A lot of that stuff would help stay in Texas instead of turning prosecution of local corruption over to the feds, which I think is a terrible idea. I like getting rid of corruption, but I'd rather it stay in Texas than the feds. Okay, but I digress. Okay. The other thing would be great is if wouldn't it be wonderful if you could go into Texas District Court and ask a Texas state judge if the federal government was violating the Constitution and have that strict? That would be pretty cool if we had some sort of declaratory judgment act where we had a cause of action just to get the judge to tell us that. I think we need legislation for that. So, and in fact, we have proposed legislation like that over the years in our Texas Sovereignty Act. Okay. Let's see. All right, I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. I'm not going to talk too much about the Texas Sovereignty Act. I think I've been down that long. Okay. The other thing that when I talk about federal acts in the Texas Sovereignty Act and in just in general, it's not just legislation or laws that can violate people's rights. It's also regulations, the administrative state, which probably is unconstitutional in and of itself from a separation of powers perspective. But then you've got executive orders, which, of course, is kind of the cool happening thing to do tyranny nowadays, right? And then you've got the order or decision of a federal court. Can you say Roe v. Wade? Or enforcement of some treaty, like small arms treaty or something like that. All of those things can violate our rights, and all of those things can be resisted with constitutional enforcement. Okay. All right. I've already talked about who enforces this. It's law enforcement and prosecuting people. But it's anybody who's sitting in government. I mean, it's like even a county clerk. I mean, if there's some sort of lien that the federal government wants to put on somebody that has come through an unconstitutional process, a county clerk can stop the machinery just by refusing to file a federal lien. When you start trying to resist tyranny, you can get real creative. The guys who want to take our liberty have been creative for a long, long time. It's time for us to start getting creative and figuring out every way we can put a monkey wrench into their tyranny machine. Okay, let's see. I'm going to see where we are. Okay. I'm going to keep going. Okay. Yes. The bottom line is, on what I'm trying to do with Texas constitutional enforcement is I want to make Texas a sanctuary state for the convention, for the Constitution. I understand that Hood County's already done a little bit of Second Amendment sanctuary stuff here at a county level. Wonderful. We've got a movement going on right now, a sanctuary movement for the unborn, where cities, primarily cities, so I don't know how many counties are doing it. Cities are saying we can't perform abortions within our boundaries. So essentially we're creating sanctuary cities, right, counties and states. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to talk about. Okay. This is a very important topic. 10th Amendment, powers not delegated to the United States are reserved to the states respectively. That's a very important word. What does it mean? Let's see what I've got here. Okay. I looked it up in Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary. Noah Webster created his first dictionary. It took him a long time, but he was at the original Constitutional Convention pushing. He wrote an article pushing for the Constitution to begin with. And he wrote his dictionary to preserve the meaning of the words of the Constitution. In his definition, respectively, essentially what he said is that respectively means unilaterally or individually. It's the opposite of collectively. That means the Lone Star State, according to the 10th Amendment, and according to the guys who wrote the Constitution or were involved in the writing, the Lone Star State, all by its lonesome, can resist federal tyranny by doing our own interpretation of our independent understanding of the Constitution. We don't have to wait on New York or California or 34 other states or 30 other states before we can start getting our freedom back. We can do it right now. Okay, and then this is another way of saying what we're talking about. I don't want Charles Schumer running my life. I don't want Nancy Pelosi running my life. How about you guys, right? I don't want a Delaware guy, Joe Biden, running my life. I want to let Texans run Texas. I don't know, this is just an aside. I wrote an editorial on this and posted it just yesterday, I think. I started thinking about what these Dems, the Democratic House members, some people are calling them millipedes. I like cheating bees. I think that's the right. But It's not just that they abandoned their post, right? It's going to be futile. We're going to get it. We're going to go until we get it, just like we did in 2003 when the Dems didn't want to redistrict. And Perry kept pushing, we got it. But the thing is, this time, instead of last time they ran on Oklahoma or New Mexico, this time, where did these guys run to? The place that Texans hate more than any other place, Devil City, District of Columbia. Right? Okay. But it's even worse. Okay, was James Talarico and all the others, what were they up there pushing and lobbying for? They were trying to get the Congress and the Senate to pass this awful H.R. 1, and I guess it's S.R. 1, I don't know what the numbers are, I don't pay attention to the facts, but I know that what they were trying to do is introduce a statute that would completely take over Texas elections. So who could be on our rolls and every procedure known to man that can allow you to cheat, they have it in this bill, right? What were these guys going up there to do? They were going up to lobby for Charles Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden to take over our elections. How crazy is that? The thing is, I don't think it's playing very well. I think most Texans really want to, you look at our history. The history of Texas is not really liking those guys from those up in Northeast running our lives, right? Or not liking the guys down in Mexico City from running our lives. So I think they made a tactical mistake. It's clear that those Dems don't want to let Texans run Texas. Let's see what we got. Okay. And this is a very wise woman, my wife, had this to say in testimony on the Texas Sovereignty Act in 2017. And I just read it because I just love the way she said it. She said, it's already constitutional to enforce the Constitution. We only lack one thing, and it's the one thing we have the most control over, the will to do so. It's all in our mindset that we are supreme when it comes to enforcing our state and federal constitutions. You've heard the old adage, where there's a will, there's a way. Well, the reverse is true. Where there is no will, there is no way. But we can change this. Change it right now. All we have to do to regain our freedom is act like the sovereign we are. Change your mindset, change the world. That's what constitutional enforcement is all about. And then, Trump has had a tremendous impact on this party, hasn't he? I've got a Trumpization of Texas constitutional enforcement. We need to make Texas sovereign again. Okay. Okay, now, I think the next phase of my speech is going to be to talk about tyranny at the state level and violations of the Texas Constitution, especially in relation to all this COVID stuff. Before I dive into that, I want to stop and just take maybe one or two questions about the interaction with the feds before we go on to interaction with the state. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Okay. Full transparency, I'm retired federal agent, 35 years of law.
Yes.
And you said something, listen, I believe the Department of Justice is corrupt.
I do
It
too.
no longer serves the United States of America. The FBI is no longer serving America. But I look at the district attorney here. You talk about the findings of the federal law enforcement, which I love. I don't take offense to it because I think there needs to be some transparency. Who does Sheriff Deeds call, and how do you counsel Sheriff Deeds if a possible illegal immigrant gets dropped off into the city squares that go all over the United States? The district attorney can't prosecute. The Sheriff Deeds can't arrest them unless they break the law, the state law. So would you counsel him not to call ICE and come get him? Now, if you call ICE today, folks, they're going to just pat him on the face and give him come back to court for 3 or 4 years and say don't do it. So you can't be so black and white, Mr. Class. There has to be a spirit of cooperation with the district attorney's not looking at me right now, but there has to be some spirit of cooperation between the district attorney, Sheriff Deeds, and federal law enforcement. We got to find the relationship that they us some laws that are too big for the district attorney, and I think you would agree with that. Some cases expand Congress. So, listen, the Department of Justice is corrupt, in my opinion. 35 years ago, it's law enforcement. I cannot imagine I ever say that, but I'm saying it today. But you have to have some spirit of cooperation with the federal government. If you tell local law enforcement don't deal with the feds, in many cases, we're going to have a real problem in the city. It's local. Right, I wrote Senator Corner. I actually quietly standing up. Got the Juneteenth bill. That's the only time we ever see corn. All I got, ladies and gentlemen, is a high curve. Same old political line. It's local. It is local. Guys, I agree with you that. There's got to be, it's not just black and white stuff.
Oh, good. All right. So essentially, we've got corrupt federal law enforcement to a large extent. And then the question is the borders is what you were asking about. And how do we deal with what's the crisis that we've got with the border of illegal aliens? I was very honored to be asked to speak in Kenny County to a collection of sheriffs down in South Texas. It included border sheriffs as well as interior sheriffs between the border and Houston. And they had a lot of county administrators, county judges and commissioners is there as well as a few prosecutors. And we were talking about how do we in Texas do it when the federal government is not doing their job. And one of the things I said is you got to remember that essentially what's going on with this situation is in this situation the federal government is supposed to be doing what the laws are not unconstitutional that ICE and Border Patrol are supposed to be enforcing, right? It's just that their boss has given them an executive order not to enforce the law and in fact to violate the law, right? And so these guys who are career guys who put their lives on the line doing the enforcement every day out there in the mean scrub brush of the deserts of Texas are whipsawed by their boss telling them not to do the job that they were paid to do and that they signed up for, right? And so the question is, what kind of relationship should you have with them? And one of the things I said is this. I said, throughout the Trump administration, the left showed us very clearly how to resist. They had all sorts of people embedded throughout the federal bureaucracy who were resisting at every step what Donald Trump wanted to do. And I said, I don't know why guys in the Border Patrol and ICE can't do every bit of subterfuge and resistance to their boss trying to stop them from doing their duty back at them. I said, you should not, sheriffs should not cut off, especially in the border stuff, local law enforcement should not cut off their ties to the Border Patrol and ICE because I'm sure they're going to get lots of good intel about what they need to do. The thing that we talked about at that conference is what can a sheriff or what can a local county infrastructure do? And of course, those guys down there are being swamped. And the Kenny County is leading the charge, it appears to me. I think Goliad is doing a great job too, but there's a lot of them that are on the front lines that are every day having to fight this. And they're the ones that put the pressure on the governor to have the conference and bring in Donald Trump and to talk. And actually, the governor starts talking like he cares, so we're still wondering whether he really does. What I told that group of guys was, I said, look, the most important thing you can do is enforce state law. There's nothing, nobody they can try questioning you, but they will not be able to stop you from enforcing state law against criminal trespass, against human trafficking, against all about the destruction of property, criminal mischief. You name it, there's a whole bunch of law breaking going on under Texas law. You're safest and you avoid lawsuits for your county if you can do that. Of course, they've got tremendous lack of resources, right? They're being swamped so much that they don't have enough money to pay for any even temporary jails, right? And the cool thing that the governor has done by doing his emergency, he can start loosening up on some of the jail standards and that sort of stuff to allow some of these people. And if we can ever get people back in session, maybe we can get some more resources dedicated to more jails and that sort of thing to do what I think we ought to do. So, no, I don't think you should cut off all communication with the federal law enforcement. The thing is, I think local law enforcement has to, because we know that the guys at the top have gone corrupt. I mean, it's so clear to me that they have. I mean, we could go story after story after story that we know of how corrupt federal law enforcement is. I think you've got, every local law enforcement has to just keep in the back of their mind, are these guys on my side? Are the citizens of my county side or not? And you've got to differentiate when they're on the wrong side and when they are. It's called judgment, and it's a very important thing, and your local law enforcement has to have it. And that's the best thing I can do. I will say one other thing. I will shop some legislation to try to make it a little harder for the feds to use Texas fusion centers, which is supposed to be this combination of intel sharing between the federal government and locals about terrorism. And we've seen other states under Obama the feds start using it as propagandizing the locals to try to construe conservatives to be, enemy that needs to be watched. I want Texas to have a little more leeway in our law about how much we cooperate with the feds in a formal way. And that's another thing that the constitutional enforcement and I have been working on. But it's a long way. It's a very complicated question. It requires each. The cool thing about working together as a team is that each person brings their life experience and their judgment and their knowledge to the fray. We need to start talking to each other about how we think the best way is to negotiate through these terrible times. And in your experience, in your observations as a former federal law enforcement are invaluable, and I appreciate you asking the question. I hope I've answered at least a little bit about some of my thinking. Yes, sir.
Let me just say one more thing. Not that long ago when I was the agent in charge, I sat at the table with the chiefs, and I sat at the table with the agents in charge of there. George Bush was president in 2004, 5, and 6. He lost the guy in office. And some of the chiefs back then were not cooperating with ICE and detaining them after they cut loose on a felony. They were kicking them out when ICE was more than willing to hold them and they could just detain them and come get them. They wouldn't do it because they said, we don't work for the arm of the federal government. But they were letting felons know when they could be deported.
Right.
Number one.
Yeah, and we've addressed that here in Texas a little bit, I think.
Right. This is 15 years ago.
You're right.
That's the way the war occurs. Then the other part of it is the sheriffs are local. Municipalities, they run out of jail cells.
Yeah.
They're not going to hold a child. They're not going to let a child have to go for somebody looking for deportation.
Right.
So it's a complicated issue. Listen, I'm on board with you about the issues at the top. It's been going back for some time. I witnessed it. But it's not always just all federal agents are the money.
No, I agree with it. All federal agents not. In fact, we want federal agents to honor their oaths,
Absolutely.
right? And not perpetuate tyranny that their bosses are telling them to do.
And what you saw on candidate Trump, President-elect Trump, and President Trump, when they filed for affidavit to the FICE report that was false.
Right.
I don't know how many affidavits I took before a federal court. Signed in front of a judge. They took information they knew was false.
Right. Correct.
They perpetrated it.
Yeah, we could be here all day about that. I agree. I agree. All right, I'll take one other question, then I'm going to move on to the second part of my deal. Any other quick questions? Yes, ma'am.
When you mentioned we don't need the 34 states anymore, are you saying that we don't need to have a constitutional convention or convention states?
Yeah, what I'm saying is, she asked, are you saying that we don't need convention of states? Okay, I'm keenly aware that I'm sitting in the district of Brian Birdwell, who is the champion of convention of states application from Texas for convention of states. He did an able job, in my opinion, in persuading the Texas government to do that. What was interesting is I was trying to get the Texas Sovereignty Act passed in the same time frame that the Convention State Call was going on. The Convention of States folks, the leaders in Texas, who I think I'm friends with, I want to be friends with them, and I think they consider me friends now. They were going around telling people the only way we're going to be able to stop the feds is convention of states. And I'm sitting there going, no, we got constitutional enforcement. I say constitutional enforcement is complementary to convention of states. You can change the Constitution all you want, but if you don't enforce the new one, you're not going to be any better off than what you got. Enforcement is a prerequisite for changing the Constitution. It's a prerequisite for getting your liberty back, right? So, and the thing that here's the other thing I'll say in answer to that question. I saw Mark Meckler, who is the national leader of Convention of States, who's now moved to Texas, and he's running Harvard now, but he's still ahead of the Convention of States. And right after the election, or right after the steal, whatever you want to call it, when Biden had come into office, Mark Meckler was invited by Glenn Beck to be on his show. And Glenn said, oh, Mark, man, we need the Convention of States more than ever now. Tell us when we're going to get the call done and get this convention going. And Mark said, well, I think we're going to have enough states to call the convention maybe by the end of 2026. I think it's kind of going slow. And you can just see Glenn's face, he just fell. It just fell. And he goes, we need it now, Mark. We need it now. And that's the point. But depending on other people to get your freedom back, it's a thing that's not going to work very well. That's just not, it's a practical thing for me. Article 5 is part of the Constitution, if we can do it. But the deal is, you think about how rigged and how propagandized the United States is right now. I worry about what comes out of this convention or where it could happen. I'm not saying that we don't need things, but the deal is we've got a solution we can go with now. I'm going to prioritize on what I can control and on what I can do now. And the deal is Texas has already made the call, right? We're waiting on other states. I actually have a meme that showed the skeleton on the bench saying, still waiting on other states to give Texas its liberty. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. I don't begrudge anybody who's good. I share the goals of any person who's been an avid advocate of convention of states. I just think I have a better solution. That's the answer to that question.
I thought that's what you were saying.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to go on to my next slide. Okay. All right. We've lived through the most intense period of propaganda in American history over the last year. Everything surrounding us is telling, whether it's media, big tech, governmental officials, have been telling us a big lie. The big lie is that we need dictatorship to save the lives of people, especially grandma. Right? I'm here to tell you that is a big lie, because the truth is that command and control doesn't save lives, it destroys lives. And we have all the evidence in front of us right here in Texas, right? Freedom works. When you're in an uncertain situation that you don't know exactly what's going on, having somebody who doesn't know what they're doing tell you in detail what you're supposed to do is not the way to survive. People have their own goals, their own situations, and they need the flexibility to respond, and they need information, to respond to the situation as best meets their own life goals and best meets their life situation. That's why this has been so terrible, is that we've been propagandized that dictatorship is great. We do need government in disasters. I'm not going to deny that. What do you need the government to do in a disaster? You need them to surge governmental resources where they're needed. When President Trump helped speed up vaccine production, wonderful. When Governor Abbott helped speed up getting PPE to our health care providers, wonderful. That's fine. But if you need to inform the public about the best information that you have about what's going on and suggest course of actions. But what we do not need is dictators who figure out, okay, today 50% of a restaurant works and will save people's lives, but tomorrow 75% will be okay. That's ridiculous. That's emperor has no clothes stuff, right? Okay. The other thing is as I got into it, started researching it, the existing Texas Disaster Act is unconstitutional. Your state senator, Brian Birdwell, recognized that, introduced wonderful legislation, which I testified for, worked with his staff on, to try to get passed, and then watched Dustin Burrows torpedo it at the end from the House side, to try to start getting some of the bad parts of the Texas Disaster Act repealed. But it's still in place because the governor was in there behind the scenes, pulling the strings, especially in the House. Birdwell knew he was going up against a powerful player and played it skillfully, in my opinion, in terms of what happened in the legislature. I was in the trenches and know all the details of a whole bunch of the details of what happened in terms of trying to get some legislation to stop us never having lockdowns ever again, as well as other liberties protected. But we didn't. We got a few things going, and I can talk about that in a question and answer if people want. But the thing is, grants of power to the executive during a disaster should be heavily conditioned, and a detailed list of limitations are needed, in my opinion. It's kind of like writing a constitution for the federal government. We said, enumerated powers, baby. You can only do these things. And on top of that, we're going to write in the Bill of Rights that says, and you can't do these, for sure. Now, I know we didn't say you could, but you can't do it, right? We need that when we're doing an executive power delegation. And so that's the kind of stuff we were trying to work on in this last legislative session. Okay, let me see what's next. Okay. Now, I'm going to do this, kind of go to fundamental stuff. I want to, because this is important. In the argumentation we've been watching in just the last few days, where the progressives are once again trying to make the case that dictatorship is needed once again, we've got to go back to fundamentals. And so let me start with this. We have a wonderful document in our nation's history that most countries don't have the luxury of having. We have a document that actually said why the framers were trying to do what they were going to do. It's called the Declaration of Independence. It is a wonderful document that tells us the philosophy we should be using as we try to implement our constitutions, because the constitutions were designed to implement these ideas. It said all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, right? And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That's what our Constitution is all about. What they talk about was creating a republic. A republic is a system of governments, the purpose of which is to protect the natural individual rights of every individual. That's probably done it, but anyway, good enough. And the framers told us what they gave us. When Benjamin Franklin walked out of the Constitutional Convention, one said, what kind of government did you give us, Mr. Franklin? He said, a republic if you can keep it. A republic. All right. A guy who put his life on the line for American liberty, Lafayette from France, said, true republicanism is the sovereignty of the people. There are natural rights which the entire nation has no right to violate. That's what a republic is, guys. Okay. Let me go to this. All right. Let's talk about the democracy versus republic. A democracy elevates a process of government to a goal. When it does that, it tries the highest principle to be that a majority can violate the rights of a minority. That's what a democracy is. A Republican government uses democracy as a process to select leaders, but it puts all sorts of structural and procedural and supermajority requirements in place to secure individual rights. Republics exist to protect the ultimate minority, the individual, from the tyranny of the majority. That's why we're here. This is a Republican Party, right? And we're the ones for the Constitution, what the framers made. Okay. In fact, Benjamin Franklin, again, described democracy. Democracy is two wolves in a lamb, voting on what to have for dinner. Okay, and then there's one other thing I want to talk about is the different constitutions, Texas and the United States Constitution. The Texas Constitution is primarily restrained on Texas officials. The federal Constitution primarily restrained on federal officials. Yeah, the federal Constitution restrained Texas officials via the 14th Amendment. Okay? And what's interesting is that the Texas Constitution and the precedents in the Supreme Court of Texas are probably constrained Texas officials more than the U.S. Constitution constrains Texas officials or federal officials. Okay? And what's even more interesting is the U.S. Supreme Court defers to the Texas Supreme Court in the interpretation of our Constitution. So when I started to focus on state-level tyranny as I started getting into this stuff, I realized we need to be talking about the Texas Constitution. And now I have a challenge for you. Okay. I have a challenge. I want you to word search the Texas Constitution. I want you to look for the words public health, health and safety, police power, common good, or even the word that's in the United States Constitution, general welfare. I will tell you, I've done that. There is not a single instance of those listed as a goal of the government of Texas. Okay? Now let's go back to the fundamentals of Texas. In our declaration, we said it a little bit differently. We just kind of assumed that the United States Declaration was already, everybody knew. And they talked about, they were talking about Santa Ana. When a government has ceased to protect the lives, liberty, and property of the people, kind of like they're talking about the function of our government, right? Okay? From whom its legitimate powers are derived, and for the advancement of whose happiness it was instituted. Okay. Then, look at the Texas Bill of Rights for you. That the general, great, and essential principles of liberty and free government may be recognized and established. That's the purpose of our Texas Constitution. That's the purpose of our republic, right? Okay. Let's see. And then we have Justice Don Willett, who was Texas Supreme Court Justice when he wrote this. He's now on the Fifth Circuit in the federal bench. He said, the Texas Constitution, then and today, exists to secure liberty. Okay? It's sad that I have to talk about these things, but we don't talk about them very much anymore, do we? Okay. And then I got to read this because it just gives me chills every time. This is when they first wrote the Texas State Bill of Rights. This was the last section. There's stuff after it. Section 29. To guard against the transgressions of the high powers herein delegated, we declare that everything in this Bill of Rights is accepted out of the general powers of government and shall forever remain inviolate. And all laws contrary thereto, or the following provisions shall be void. I just love it. Forever remain inviolate. That's what they did when they created our Constitution, what they wanted us to be doing. And then we have, I think the Texas Supreme Court did a pretty abysmal job during this COVID tyranny stuff, but they did do one early on case on the COVID tyranny. In the very first sentence, in the very first case, the Texas Supreme Court said, the Constitution is not suspended when the government declares a state of disaster. Okay? I will remind you that the guys who wrote this Constitution had just lived under a dictator by the name of a Republican dictator, sadly enough, by the name of E.J. Davis. And they did not want to see that dictatorial power in the hands of the governor repeated. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about the constitutional case for why pandemic lockdowns, mask mandates, etc. are unconstitutional. First, we've got the separation of powers stuff. I'll talk about that in a minute. We've got due course of law I'll talk about. The definition and application of the natural rights in the Bill of Rights. I've already talked about that. I probably won't talk about that too much. Or equal protection. All I will say on equal protection is this. I don't think if you say one person's essential and another person's non-essential that you're treating people equally. How about that? Okay. In short, on the separation of powers, here's a newsflash for you. Governor Abbott, anyone? Executive orders are not law. Okay? There is a proper place for executive orders. Executive orders are communications from the head of the executive branch to his superior, the inferiors in the executive branch, about how to follow the law, how to comply with the Constitution, how to do your job, what our policy is within the constraints of the law and the Constitution. But what you can guarantee, if you have in an executive order the creation of a penalty or defining an act that can be penalized in an executive order, that is an invalid executive order, right? It is lawmaking. They talk about legislation from the bench. You know, the judiciary should do that. The executive orders that the governor did was legislation from the governor's bench, right? Okay. Let's see. Okay. Then we have Article 2, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution is our separation of powers provision. I will not bore you with reading it. It says only the legislature makes laws. And I'll come back and say it. If you purport to penalize someone with a new act or put in a new penalty in an executive order, that's a law. And you can play tricky tricks with like the Texas Disaster Act does this. Oh, it has the force and effect of law. Well, isn't that an admission that it's not a law? You say it has the force and effect? And doesn't it say, this is just a lie. Force and effect of law language in our Texas Disaster Act is a lie. They're lying so they can hope that they can get away with violating the separation of powers provision. Right? That's what it is. Okay. All right. And then we get into lockdowns. This is very important. This is a liberty principle that they're trying to keep on with the lie. Here's what the logic of lockdowns, and now they're applying it to the vaccine mandates. Everyone is presumed guilty of being a threat to others without even a chance to prove your innocence. Right? That's what the logic is. You're guilty of being a threat just by existing, just by walking around. Right? You might, in some remote way, be a threat to somebody else. Therefore, we get to run your life. That's the logic of it. Right? That's the logic that I heard the governor of California say just this morning on the news. It was like, okay, because you haven't been vaccinated, you might be a threat to people who have been vaccinated. That's a head scratcher. But even if it's true, there's some remote risk that you might be a threat to somebody else. Therefore, we get to run your life. No, sir, that's not liberty. You accept that principle, liberty is gone. Okay, let's talk about due course of law. We have it in the Texas Bill of Rights, Article 1, Section 19. No citizen of this state shall be deprived of life, liberty, property, privilege, or immunities, or in any manner disenfranchised except by due course of law of the land. Okay? In the federal Constitution, they talk about due process, what they call due course in Texas. Okay. Now, the next thing is, what's the most fundamental principle of due course of law? Well, it's not explicitly laid out in the Constitution. It's laid out in the Code of Criminal Procedure. It's called innocent until proven guilty, right? The law presumes you innocent until proven guilty. That's what makes all of this stuff, presuming you to be guilty without even proving it, without even getting a chance to prove that you're not, is such a fundamental violation of due process. Okay. Okay. They tried to lever this stuff by presuming, they talked about asymptomatic transfer, which they never proved, by the way. If you read the science, they never proved it. They just said, yeah, maybe, we think so, maybe. And of course, even if they do an asymptomatic transfer, then you ask, what are the odds? What are the odds that me, not knowing I'm sick, that I'm walking around thinking I'm healthy, but I'm really not? What are the odds that I'm actually going to hurt somebody? It's incredibly low. If you apply this logic to, and by the way, they started talking about drunk driving laws. Okay. The deal is, drunk driving laws is not a good analogy of this stuff. Drunk driving laws, I think, is legitimate. If you are in a demonstrated threat, or if you've reached a high enough level of threat by your actions, by your illegitimate actions to somebody else, okay, we can do a little bit of prior restraint there. I don't like that. I admit it's a little bit of a slippery slope. But the real analogy is saying you can't drive because you might kill somebody when you're driving. You might get distracted. You might reach that radio. The kid might yell at you in the back seat. Right? So you might kill somebody. Therefore, we're going to deny you the liberty of driving. That's what lockdowns are. That's what the mask mandates are. That's what all that stuff is. And the principle, it's the dream of every progressive. You know what a definition of progressive is? It's a progressive is someone who has a burning desire to run the lives of other people. Right? They've got to do it. It's built in. And this stuff is giving them the best opportunity they've ever had to run our lives. We cannot allow this to be a precedent for future. We've got to stop it now. Okay. All right. Anyway, so I've done enough there. Okay. Let's see. I want to make sure I got this. All right. Okay. We showed the power of constitutional enforcement during this COVID tyranny. The judiciary, which you would have hoped would have stopped a lot of this stuff, was almost AWOL during this tyranny. Okay? We did have, with a shining example of the writ of habeas corpus that the Texas Supreme Court did to stop, to get Shelley Luther out of jail and to stop that. And it made the governor blink. I mean, he hates Shelley Luther. Oh, he hates me. Because he embarrassed him. She embarrassed him because he was taking away Texas liberty, destroying 3 million jobs, hundreds of thousands of people's life changing their economic livelihoods. Okay. And the truth is the Texas governor can't impose tyranny on a county unless the local political ecosystem helps. If the county merely refuses to participate in the tyranny, it stops dead in its tracks. I'm coming back to the message. At the beginning of this thing, I decided Texas Constitutional Enforcement needed an award. And I called it the Captain America Award. I have found this quote from one of the Captain America movies. It says, doesn't matter what the press says, doesn't matter what the politicians, the mob say. Doesn't matter if the whole country decides that something is wrong, that something wrong is something right. This nation was founded on one principle above all else. The requirement that we stand up for what we believe, no matter the odds or the consequences. By the way, David Crockett said, first know your right, then go ahead. That's the Texas thing too. When the mob and the press and the whole world tell you to move, your job is to plant yourself like a tree beside the river of truth and tell the whole world, no, you live. The first recipient of the Captain America Award is right here in Hood County, and right here in this room. His name is Matt Mills.
Matt, stand up.
Matt said when he knows that executive orders are not law. And he said, as a prosecuting attorney with misdemeanors, I'm not going to prosecute anything having to do with executive orders. And he got flack from his local county ecosystem. But he stood like a tree beside the river of truth and faced down the opposition and protected the liberty of the people here in Hood County. So I want to say thank you, Matt, for giving us a sign. Okay, I want to talk about one final thing, and then we'll open up for questions. And that is, what we've morphed away from more lockdowns and mask mandates. They're trying to bring those back, but the real thing is we gotta force everybody to jab an experimental substance into their arm, whether they've had COVID or not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're trying to demonize and discriminate against people. I predicted that this was coming back at the before the Republican convention started last summer, and I showed up wandering around as the Texas Constitutional Enforcement had, and I persuaded the Republican Party of Texas Platform Committee to add to the platform a provision that says we need to call for a new provision of the Texas Bill of Rights to explicitly recognize the natural and inalienable right of Texans not to be vaccinated or to refuse vaccination. And one of the reasons I did that is because if you've done any reading of judicial opinions, you know that the progressives took over the judiciary about 100 years ago. And, like I said, mandatory vaccination is a progressive dream. It allows them to do all sorts of wonderful things that they want to do. And I knew that both at the federal level and at the state level, we had pretty bad opinions from the progressives in the judiciary that said it's okay to force people to be vaccinated. The only way we're saving ourselves in Texas right now, the children of Texas, from being forced to have vaccination is through legislative action. I knew that the judiciary, with the existing presidents they have, and with the mindset that many of them have, they were not going to try to recognize an unenumerated natural right without it being explicitly recognized, and that's why I did it. And I wanted to go ahead and put up what I shopped in the Texas legislature this time, which is in addition to the Bill of Rights. And I will read it to you. It said, this is what I want to add to the Texas Constitution, Bill of Rights. The unalienable natural right of the people to refuse vaccination shall not be infringed. Because the right is unalienable, it cannot be bargained away, and therefore vaccination shall not be made a condition of employment, travel, attending educational institutions, doing business, receiving governmental services, or any other action. I didn't get any takers. I'm hoping that we work on it a little bit more. We'll, in 2023, we'll be able to make this happen. What's interesting about this is to get a constitutional amendment passed in Texas, of course, it takes 2/3 of both chambers of the legislature, but it doesn't have to go to the governor. One of the things that Senator Birdwell knew he was facing when he was trying to get restrictions on the executive overreach was that what the governor was going to do, he could veto it. And so he started off trying to do a constitutional amendment to try to bypass the governor. And of course that ran into the buzzsaw of Dustin Burrows in the House. Constitutional amendment. And of course, now, I don't know if you saw that a lot of the cheater D's that have left to Texas have now been calling for mandatory vaccinations. Donna Howard out of Houston, I know, in particular. Although what's interesting, what's sort of amazing to me is, I'll say one other thing just as an aside. We had, Dustin Burrows did introduce a bill, which was a visual bill, but we worked on it and we got it to be a lot better bill by the time it passed the House, called HB 3. It was supposed to be one that was to be addressed called the Tyranny and to make sure we don't do it again, although it didn't start off very good. But the wonderful thing about that is the hearing on HB 3 was the first one in Texas since the COVID tyranny had begun where the people of Texas got to actually talk to their representatives about what had happened to them in this tyranny. It was a wonderful moment for Texas. It was a cathartic moment for Texas. There were multiple times during that when people were telling their stories of how governmental interference, not the COVID, but governmental interference in the COVID had destroyed their lives, ruined wonderful moments they could have been for their family. One of the people that cried about that was Donna Howard. Donna Howard said that she got over 100 in the most liberal district probably in Texas, in Travis County. She said she got over 100 communications saying that HB 3 wasn't good enough for me to either stop it or make it a lot better. And she didn't get a single one in favor of it. So I think the people of Texas behind us, whether we can get 2/3, to stop the mandatory vaccination. It'll be interesting to see how this next political cycle is just as important. Every time they say it's an important political cycle, but this is more important probably for our liberty than ever before. So I will stop it there. Let's see. Oh, no, I'm not going to stop it. I have one other thing I want to do. I found this quote from C.S. Lewis, which I think expresses, talks about Greg Abbott. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their consciences. In my opinion, what happened to Greg Abbott is that this, I think, a decent man, certainly a bright man, an energetic man, one devoted to trying to do the right thing in his mind, got turned. And he became persuaded that his mission as governor was not to do what the Constitution said and protect our liberties. He became persuaded his mission was to make us all safe and to be our nanny. And you saw the results. So that's, I wanted you to hear that. And then there's one other one, which talks about the power struggle that's going on right now. This is Daniel Webster, who, by the way, there's a lot of things I don't like about him, but this is a good quote. There are men in all ages who mean to exercise power usefully, but who mean to exercise it. They mean to govern well, but they mean to govern. They promise to be kind masters, but they mean to be masters. That's what we're up against. That's what we hope constitutional enforcement and adherent to the principles of liberty, natural rights, and the Constitution can win us, how we can win our liberty back. And now I will really stop and take questions. Where are we sitting on time? Okay. I'll take questions. Oh, yes, sir. I did not understand the question. Please repeat. So just say one more time.
The recent social media, like Facebook, blocking people and...
Oh, okay. He's saying social media has been suppressing speech, suppressing people with ideas about liberty. In fact, Jared just told me something, I forget your name. But anyway, just told me that he got suppressed just because he said, I prefer this candidate because they support the Constitution. He was blocked from posting on Facebook for a week. I got banned from doing some things this morning myself, and they didn't tell me why. In the regular session and in this special session, bills were introduced in the Senate, maybe in the House too, but I know about the Senate more. And introduced in the State Affairs. Senator Birdwell was the Vice Chair of State Affairs, and he was there at the hearings. I testified at the special session hearings just a few weeks ago. And the bill essentially says, okay, Facebook, you're saying you're going to be doing free speech. If you've got standards, you've got to let people know. We're going to create a process by which if you're going to ban somebody or punish them, you have to give them due process, and you have to tell them why, and you have to give them an appeal process. You have to give them a real person to talk to. You can't just have this, hide behind the page. And so essentially said, if it's speech, you're going to, at Facebook in Texas, you're going to allow it to happen. That was the bill. It passed the Senate. Senator Birdwell was very attentively watching the testimony. I am in favor of that. Some people have said, oh, Tom, aren't you a supporter of property rights and people's freedom to do what they want to with their own property? And therefore, shouldn't you defend Facebook's right to suppress us? And my answer to that is this. It comes back to this unalienable thing to a certain extent that the framers talked about. My question is, if I go onto a person's piece of property under one set of rules and I'm there, Do they have the right to change the rules after they kidnap me or enslave me? No. I think I have an unalienable right not to be enslaved just because I'm on somebody's property or invited onto their property. Do they have the right to murder me? No, they do not. I have an unalienable right not to be murdered. They said, oh, the Bill of Rights is designed against government. And I said, well, the system of government that we did was protect our individual, unalienable, natural rights. Governments, for sure, are the biggest violators of rights around. But criminals violate rights every day when they murder, they rape, or they steal, etc., etc. That's why they talk, in judicial opinions, when they talk about police power, that's the legitimate police power of our government is when they pass laws that are designed to protect the natural and individual rights from other citizens in our society. Well, I think I'm coming more and more to believe that our freedom of speech is an unalienable right, especially when it comes, when you think about exactly what's going on here, guys. I mean, we know this now. Donald Trump taught it to us, right? There is a deep state, right? I wrote an article about all this vaccination stuff. I called it killing for profit and power. Big Pharma is willing to suppress information about life-saving existing drugs like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin so that they can sell more vaccines or sell more therapeutics, right? The Big Pharma is probably the most powerful special interest that has captured our government ever before, right? And I guarantee part of what they're doing with Facebook is they're turning Facebook into the whole propaganda machine into a sales machine for Big Pharma. They're using government to benefit one special interest at the expense of our liberty. I'm not going to stand for that. And I don't think Facebook has the right to violate my natural rights. They're unalienable. Just because I go into their property and then I spend decades of my life, a decade of my life, building relationships, building content. That's my property. I created it. It's not theirs. And so I have no problem with the state of Texas protecting the rights of Texans to speak freely on the Facebook platform and give us due process. Any other questions? Okay, thanks. It was wonderful. If you haven't signed up my sign-up sheet, find it, sign up, and we'll see you later. Thanks.